Hi, when I first made a video about the Canadian Armed Forces back in 2024, I painted a picture of a military that was badly under-resourced, structurally uncertain or confused about what it was supposed to be and what it was supposed to be able to do, and really struggling to decide what its priorities were. We really had sort of like, we need to be able to do everything, and yet there was so little money that honestly, it kind of couldn't do anything. So where do you go from there? Now, that video did quite well. Actually, I'm very pleased with that. And the basic thrust still holds. However, there are two big problems with the video that I made back in 2024. So first of all, since then, a lot has changed. A lot has changed on paper and also in reality. Canada has updated its defense policy. It's launched a new defense industrial strategy, and it's made some real decisions about submarines, fighters, and the structure of its army, etc. Now, second, when I made the original video, I overlooked something very important. There was a major policy document that Ottawa released in April 2024 called Our North Strong and Free, or the ONSF. It's a comprehensive update to the 2017 defense policy paper, which was called Strong, Secure, and Engaged, or the SSE. I'm going to be referring to them. There's the 2017 SSE and then the 2024 ONSF. All this really matters because it tells us what Canada's political leadership thinks the armed forces are for and what it might be prepared to do in order to enable the armed forces to do that thing that it thinks that the army, the military, Canadian military, should be able to do. Now, this is super important. As I've tried to emphasize in many videos that I've done about different nations' militaries, I've emphasized the idea that you can't build or evaluate a military unless you have some clarity about what the military's intended purpose is. What's it even for? Only then can you assess whether or not its design, its equipping, its force structure, its this or that, correspond at all with the missions that it is assigned, right? So in this video, I'm going to do three things. First, I want to walk through the ONSF, the Our North Strong and Free document. That's from the one from 2024, and look at how it revises or at least refrains the earlier Strong, Secure, and Engaged policy from 2017. What changed conceptually? Second, I want to highlight the shift in priorities of what Ottawa now says is the most important thing for the Canadian Armed Forces to be able to do and why. And then third, I want to look at what Ottawa has actually done and plans to do in order to put all this into effect. And I'm going to look at the Army and the Navy and the Air Force. So what has Ottawa done in order to change these priorities into actual capabilities? Now, by the end, I hope that you will have a much clearer sense of where Canada's head is, where it thinks its military is supposed to be headed between now and, let's say, the mid-2030s, and how much of this is real versus aspirational. If you're new here, my name is Michael Shurkin, and welcome to my YouTube channel, Pax Americana, a conversation about world affairs, global conflict, military strategy, and anything else that happens to be on my mind. As usual, if you like this, please hit like and subscribe, and think about becoming a member of the channel on YouTube, or tossing some change my way using the thanks button here, or by buying me a coffee using the link in the description below. So let's get to it. Part 1, from Strong, Secure, and Engaged to Our North, Strong, and Free. Anyway, let's start with the two documents, and something I really like doing. I like doing a deep dive into documents and comparing and contrasting. In 2017, the Trudeau government, remember Justin Trudeau? Nowadays he's busy hanging out with Katy Perry, right? But back in the day when he actually ran the Canadian government, he released Strong, Secure, and Engaged. That policy gave us the now familiar slogan, Canada should be strong at home, secure in North America, and engaged in the world. And it framed the Canadian Armed Forces, the CAF, as I might sometimes call it in this video, as an agile, multi-purpose, combat-ready force able to do everything from humanitarian assistance to peacekeeping to high-intensity combat. This, of course, is almost an absurdity because it's so much harder to do than to say, given Canada's paltry defense budgets, the fact that it's been spending consistently like just over 1% for many, many years, the Canadian Armed Forces' tiny size, and its general lack of modernization. So even on paper, it can do just about anything in theory because it looks like it's got the full panoply of capabilities. We can talk about full spectrum capabilities, but in reality, it really can't do a whole lot of anything. There's simply too few people and too little stuff. That's just a reality. SSC also introduced a process mantra, and the mantra is anticipate, adapt, act. The idea was that the CAF needed to improve its intelligence and surveillance capabilities to adapt to new technologies like cyber and space, and then be able to act decisively with allied forces whenever necessary. And it laid out 8 core missions. First, defend Canada. Second, defend North America with the United States. 3, support NATO and coalition operations, which could be anything from full-blown war to, peacekeeping missions. I don't remember what number we're at. Is that 4? I don't know. Contribute to peace operations, build partner capacity, assist civil authorities and law enforcement, respond to disaster, and conduct search and rescue. Now, in other words, you could call the SSC, the 2017 document, as a sort of classical, very Canadian, sort of liberal internationalist defense policy. It's very broad. It's global, and it's very much focused on the Canadian Armed Forces as a multi-purpose tool for engagement. This is like a Leatherman tool that can kind of do a little bit of everything, although nothing particularly well because it's just a Leatherman, right? Sometimes you need something big, for example. Fast forward to April 2024, and Ottawa published the Our North Strong and Free, a renewed vision for Canada's defense. The ONSF, as I call it, explicitly builds on the 2017 document, the SSE, but the tone and the structure are different. ONSF says, in effect, that there are 3 things reshaping Canada's security. First, climate change, especially in the Arctic and the far north. Second, autocracies, explicitly Russia and China, challenging the international order. Later, post-2024, there are hints that they kind of include Trump along with that. Third, disruptive technologies such as hypersonic missiles, cyberspace, AI, etc. It moves from the SSC mantra of anticipate, adapt, and act to a new triad, very catchy, that the CAF, the Canadian Armed Forces, must be ready, resilient, and relevant. Ready means you got to have enough people trained and equipped with functioning infrastructure. Resilient means being able to sustain operations over time in multiple domains, land, sea, air, cyberspace, and then all of this, of course, will be connected by fancy schmancy digital networks. And relevant means being able to make robust contributions where it matters, most to Canada, not everywhere all the time. So one wants Canada to be able to throw its weight behind efforts that matter most, which requires having some weight, right? If you don't have any weight, you can't throw it behind anything. And it also requires having a little bit of clarity about what matters most for Canada. So this all sounds good. I would argue that already we're heading in a good direction. Most importantly, I would argue the ONSF does something that the SSE, the 2017 document, never did, which is that it clearly ranks the missions in order of priority. So the ONSF says that, quote, the most urgent and important task, unquote, facing Canada is asserting its sovereignty in the Arctic and northern regions and defending North America, especially through that northern approach. Everything else, NATO, the Indo-Pacific, peace operations, comes after that. So the shift is this. Whereas the 2017 document, the SSC, spoke of having a broad set of missions and saying that we need a flexible military that can do a little bit of everything, everywhere. The ONSF is saying, no. The CAF's first job is the Arctic and continental defense against Russia and China, and then making meaningful contributions to NATO and the Indo-Pacific. And really everything else is just kind of, once you get to sort of Russia, China, the Arctic, the far north, and then maybe NATO, then everything else is really, bottom of the list. Part 2, changing threat perceptions, Russia, China, the US, and NATO. Let's dig a bit more into how Ottawa's view of the threat environment shifts between the 2 documents, because that drove its priorities. So let's begin with Russia and Ukraine. In 2017, the SSC talked about an evolving balance of power, hybrid warfare, gray zone tactics. Russia's mentioned, but mostly as one of several state competitors. This is pre-2022, thus there's not yet a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, although, as we know, the war actually started in 2014. By 2024, the ONSF has a different tone. Russia's invasion of Ukraine is described as, quote, illegal and unprovoked, unquote, an attack on the international rules and institutions that underpin Canada's security and prosperity. Russia is called a reckless and hostile adversary, willing to undermine peace and stability. The ONSF explicitly links the war in Ukraine to the price of groceries and fuel in Canada. supply chains, energy prices, inflation, etc. This is classic political framing, but it's important because it helps make the case that Ukraine is a Canadian domestic issue, not just a distant foreign policy concern. And it says outright, Canadians cannot take global security for granted. Next, China in the Indo-Pacific. It's super interesting. The 2017 document, the SSE, recognizes a shifting balance of power and the rise of emerging powers, but it doesn't hammer home China specifically. The tone is we need to balance traditional relationships with engagement, with emerging powers, and adapt to new domains like cyber and space. The ONSF, the 2024 document, by contrast, calls China outright an increasingly capable and assertive global actor looking to reshape the international system to advance its interests and values, which increasingly diverge from our own on matters of defense and security. It says China is undertaking, quote, the most ambitious military buildup since the Second World War, unquote. It lists out naval, submarine, nuclear, space, cyber, etc., AI, quantum capabilities, and accuses Beijing of coercion in the South China Sea and the Taiwan Strait, and of seeking exclusive control over international waterways. It also notes China's ambition to be a polar great power by 2030, notwithstanding the fact that China is not a polar or Arctic country, but whatever, it has the ambition. In other words, China has moved from a, quote, emerging power we need to engage, unquote, to a strategic competitor with global and Arctic ambitions that threaten the rules we depend on. Next, the U.S., North America, and NATO. Now, keep in mind the 2024 document was written before the second Trump administration, and thus before the souring of relations between the United States and Canada under Trump's leadership, and of course, certainly before Trump started threatening Greenland and Denmark. If you've made it so far in this video, I'll ask you to indulge me for a moment in which I shamelessly promote a little book that I published recently via Amazon called The French Way of War, or in the French version, which I translated and published, so you can also buy this in French. The title is Penser la guerre à la française. Frankly, I actually like that title better than the English title. It's just about like thinking war French style. Regrettably, I only came up with it after I published the English one, whatever. The book is a distillation of years of work that I've done reading deeply in 20th and 21st century French military strategy. It provides what I think is a wonderfully useful framework for thinking about strategy and thinking about conflict. Now, I'm sure some of you are thinking, why should I listen to French military strategists? Haven't they lost a bunch of wars? Well, briefly, so have we Americans. I don't think we've done any better than the French. In fact, if you look at the larger historical record, the French are on top of the whole thing. But unlike Americans, and I'm very sincere about this, the French have taken their defeats and their military catastrophes of the 20th century to heart and worked hard to understand what the heck happened to them. I have seen, and I insist on this, I have seen very little trace of any such reflection on the American side. Plus, the French write exceptionally well. So, better to read the work of men who not only write well, but who strive to understand the military's defeats than that of men who generally write badly and prefer to rest on laurels that honestly no longer exist. Enough of that. Now, part 3, new priorities. What is the CAF even for? Let's zoom in on what the ONSF says is the Canadian Armed Forces' main mission. What is it supposed to do? Or what are they supposed to do? Because it's really plural. The formal list of core missions is unchanged from the SSE, the 2017 document, but the 2024 ONSF rearranges them in practice by how it allocates attention and money. We can think of the new priorities in 3 layers. Priority 1, Arctic sovereignty and continental defense. The ONSF calls asserting sovereignty in the Arctic and the North, quote, the most urgent and important task facing Canada. That's strong language. Why? Because climate change is warming Canada's Arctic roughly 4 times faster than the global average. Sea ice is retreating. By mid-century, the Arctic Ocean could be a key shipping route between Europe and Asia. That opens up opportunities, but also the risk of foreign military presence. Submarines, long-range aircraft, surveillance platforms, all operating in and around Canadian territory. That would be a bad thing. The ONSF explicitly mentions increased Russian activity in Canadian air approaches and a growing number of Chinese dual-use research and surveillance vessels. The policy response is this: increase your presence, reach, mobility, and responsiveness in the Arctic in the North. That's the main priority, which means permanent or at least persistent CAF presence up north, new northern support hubs, Arctic-capable logistics and mobility, and a layered system of sensors, satellites, aircraft, and ships. Continental defense is, of course, the second half of that priority. It's not just about showing the flag. It's about making sure that hypersonic and cruise missiles, submarines, and aircraft can't use the Arctic as a backdoor into North America. Priority 2, contributing meaningfully to NATO and Euro-Atlantic security. Once Canada is strong at home and secure in North America, the ONSF says it can support allies abroad without fear of retaliation. In practice, the policy singles out the Euro-Atlantic. It underlines Canada's role in NATO's enhanced forward presence, especially in Latvia. It shows long-term support for Ukraine through training, equipment, and financial assistance. And it talks about giving the CAF greater abilities to sustain themselves in conflict and strike at longer operational ranges than our adversaries. The CAF is no longer pitched as a global peacekeeping force. It's primarily now a Arctic defense force plus a NATO contributor that can contribute high-end, great power, competition, caliber, conventional forces. Priority 3. Now we get to the Indo-Pacific and global stability. Yeah, the Indo-Pacific gets more attention in the 2024 document than it did in the 2017 document. Canada now has a formal Indo-Pacific strategy. The ONSF positions CAF contributions, naval deployments, air patrols, exercises as part of a broader effort to deter Chinese coercion and to uphold quote-unquote global rules and freedom of navigation. However, at the same time, the document also creates space for operations elsewhere: Haiti, Africa, UN missions, disaster relief, search and rescue, all that sort of stuff. But the tone is just different compared to the 2017 document. All of the other stuff feels secondary. It's like it's all tossed into this miscellaneous drawer, right? The sharp edges of the policy are in the Arctic in North America and then the Euro-Atlantic, and everything else is just kind of out there. Part 4, money, people, in the industrial piece. Now, before we dive into the services, I want to talk about resources. The 2017 SSC promised to grow defense spending steadily from about 19 billion Canadian dollars, expand the regular forces to 71,500 and the reserves to 30,000. I believe this is for the entire CAF and not just for the Army. ONSF says that, no, this isn't enough. It's not fast enough. It's not ambitious enough. And it commits an additional $8.1 billion over 5 years and $73 billion over 20 years, aiming to bring defense spending up to about 1.6% of GDP by the end of the 2020s. The stated intention of reaching 2% by the end of the decade, which is not a lot. I mean, it still makes Canada one of the laggards compared to other NATO countries. I mean, fortunately, Canada has a large GDP, so any percentage increase or decimal percentage increase translates into a big chunk of change. But still, in terms of the level of effort, it's not much. On the personnel side, ONSF admits that the CAF is under strength. There's a significant gap between the authorized and actual strength in both the regular and the reserve components. Its new policy allegedly doubles down on people, recruitment reforms, retention measures, better housing, child care, health care, and a push to change the culture and to address misconduct. And crucially, it leans into defense as an industrial policy. It talks about spending, acquisition, building civilian capacity and procurement, investing in innovation, and constructing a more robust defense industrial base, something the later defense industrial strategy is going to flesh out. So the ONSF is not just a military document, it's also an economic and industrial strategy. Now, let's turn to what this means for the three main services. Part 5, the Army, restructuring and modernization. The Canadian Army is where the most visible structural changes are happening. So with respect to force structure, under the banner of Inflection Point 2025, the Army is moving away from a largely regional 4-division structure toward 3 functional divisions. We have a Defense of Canada division, which focuses on homeland and Arctic defense and leans heavily on the reserve component. Then there's a maneuver division. This is regular Army. It's heavy. It's designed for high-intensity combat, particularly in NATO contexts, places like Latvia. And then there's a training and institutional support division responsible for force generation, training, doctrine, and institutional support. This is a big conceptual shift. The Defense of Canada division essentially says the backbone of domestic and Arctic defenses will be reserve units, augmented by regulars, while the maneuver division forms the core of Canada's deployable combat power. So there's a shift favoring heavier forces, stronger forces, forces geared for conventional warfare rather than lighter duties. The modernization priorities include, among other things, the acquisition of long-range precision fire systems like HIMARS and other long-range rockets to give the Army the ability to reach deep targets both in a domestic and in a NATO context. Ground-based air defense, rebuilding air defense capabilities to protect critical infrastructure, deployed forces, and Arctic sites from drones and missiles. Air defenses is really something that all NATO powers have neglected since the end of the Cold War. Now everybody is struggling to get caught up because things have changed and things are serious. Next, we've got armored and mechanized forces. The Canadians aspire to procure roughly 250 new armored fighting vehicles for medium cavalry roles, while also modernizing the existing Leopard 2 fleet with an eye towards selecting and fielding a new battle tank at some point in the 2030s. Now, to be clear, when I talk about armored fighting vehicles, what the Canadians do not have in mind is just another iteration of the wheeled LAV, L-A-V. They want to replace it with a tracked IFV. That's in other words, something better suited for conventional warfare than the LAVs or the Strikers or that kind of wheeled vehicle. The three main candidates are the CV-90, the Korean Hanwha Redback, and the Rheinmetall Lynx. The AFVs are going to be acquired for exactly the kind of mission that Canada leads in Latvia. So the aspiration here is to be able to field and sustain a brigade-level armored combat unit against a peer threat. What's impressive here is just the clarity, whereas before, that kind of thing just got lost in a very long list of priorities. If everything's a priority, then nothing's a priority. That was the case before in 2017. Now the Canadians are actually being better at, no, that's the priority, which is great. I should add to this that the Canadians are buying new modular assault rifles, not entirely sure what that means, improved body armor, night vision, and better communications. These are modest but important gains for individual soldiers. Also, they want to add Arctic mobility, which means vehicles, infrastructure, and logistics designed for year-round operations in the north, including these new northern operational support hubs. There are some caveats. The Army remains under strength and probably will remain under strength. Recruiting has improved, but attrition is high. Readiness is uneven, and the modernization agenda is crowded. They're attempting to do a whole lot of things at the same time. And the real test is going to be whether or not Ottawa sustains the funding and throughput long enough to actually field any of these capabilities in any usable numbers. Part 6, the Navy. The Royal Canadian Navy in some ways is the most stressed service. It's trying to recapitalize almost everything at once. It's very difficult and very expensive. So, surface fleet. On paper, the surface fleet modernization is impressive. They are bringing in the Harry de Wolf class Arctic and offshore patrol ships. These are, I read, the modestly armed but ice-capable ships, which would do a lot to create presence up in the far north and to sort of do constabulary work up there. The big ticket item, though, for the Navy for surface combatants is this thing called the Canadian Surface Combatant Program, now branded as River-class destroyers. These are 15, ostensibly. Type 26 derived from the British Type 26 combatants meant to replace the Halifax-class frigates and the long-retired Iroquois-class destroyers. This is a multi-decade, multi-tens of billions program. Like with all other major programs, it remains to be seen how much money they're willing to spend in the end and how many of these do they actually buy. They say they're going to buy 15. They might end up with 6 or 4 or 10. Who knows? All this remains to be seen. And then we have this thing called the Protecteur-class joint support ships, which are being built to restore at-sea replenishment and limited sea lift, critical enablers for sustained deployment. All of this aligns perfectly with the ONSF, more Arctic presence, a modern blue water escort fleet, and the ability to operate task groups further from home. Of course, the timelines are bad. The River-class destroyers or frigates or whatever you call them won't start entering service into the early 2030s. The Halifax-class frigates, which have already gone through a midlife upgrade, are to be kept running through further life extensions and maintenance well into the 2030s. Availability has been poor, with large portions of the fleet tied up in maintenance or lacking crews. Joint support ships also are delayed compared to the original ambitions, leaving Canada dependent on allies for replenishment in the meantime. Next, we get the submarines. This is a really big deal for the Canadian Navy. On the submarine side, Canada is trying to do two things at once. Very expensive. It is trying to modernize the existing Victoria-class boats in order to keep them operational until the mid-2030s. And then at the same time, they've got this program called the Canadian Patrol Submarine Project, which is moving forward with the aim of fielding a new fleet, potentially up to 12 boats, I've read, able to patrol the Atlantic, Pacific, and increasingly the Arctic. The main contenders for this are, I believe, there's a German 212 class type sub that's in the running. And also there's a Korean submarine offered by Hanwha. That's what they're looking at now. Next, coastal defense and mine warfare. Canada plans to retire its Kingston-class maritime coastal defense vessels and replace their role with a mix of the new advanced offshore patrol vehicles and new coastal corvette-type ships in the future, as well as with uncrewed systems for mine countermeasures. That creates some gaps in coastal surveillance and mine clearance. In the longer term, it fits ONSF's vision of a more capable integrated Arctic and defense architecture. Big picture for the Navy is a classic Canadian story, ambitious plans, a national shipbuilding strategy, and some real successes, but also severe strain from delays, cost growth, and especially manpower shortages. ONSF calls for higher readiness and more presence. The Navy is struggling to crew the ships that it has. Next, we get to part 7, the Air Force. The Royal Canadian Air Force is central to the ONSF, particularly for the Arctic and the North American layers. Big ticket thing is fighter planes. Ottawa has selected the F-35A to replace the CF-18s with some 88 aircraft planned. Contracts have been signed for initial batch, and the first jets are due to arrive for training in the U.S. before being based in Canada later in the decade. The ONSF treats this as a core piece of sovereignty and NORAD. F-35s give Canada a modern air defense and strike capability, interoperable with U.S. and NATO, and with sufficient range to cover northern approaches. The politics around fleet sizing costs, however, of course, are still evolving, but the shift from geriatric Hornets to F-35s is going to happen. The question is how many? Another question is that for all sorts of reasons, Trump, the Canadians are getting cold feet regarding putting all or really any of its eggs in the F-35 basket, and there's a lot of interest in acquiring Gripens. Now, the weird thing about Gripens is that it still has a U.S.-made engine, so it's still somewhat under American ITAR control, but I suppose much less so than the F-35. So the Canadians see it as less problematic than the F-35. Presently, it looks like the Canadians are going to go ahead and buy at least some F-35s. But it also looks like they will, in addition, pick up some Gripens, perhaps to hedge its bets. The Gripens might be wrapped together with the deal that the recently signed deal with Canada agreeing to buy Saab Global I AWACS planes. I'll say a little bit more about that later. Next, we get to maritime patrol and ISR. Canada is also acquiring new maritime patrol aircraft to replace its old CP-140 Aurora. It's going to replace them with P-8 Poseidons, which seems to be a good choice. And that, again, maps directly to the ONSF's emphasis on undersea and surface threats in the Atlantic, the Arctic, and the Pacific, contributing to NATO anti-submarine warfare. Also, shipborne and shore-based drones are part of this picture as well, augmenting surveillance in the north and the sea. This brings us to the AWACS singing early warning in NORAD and air and missile defense. Canada has committed to contributing significant funds to NORAD modernization, new over-the-horizon radars, sensors, and command and control upgrades. The ONSF adds a commitment to exploring integrated and missile defense, moving beyond just warning and fighter interceptions toward a more comprehensive ability to track and, if necessary, intercept advanced cruise and hypersonic threats. In May 2026, Canada formally agreed to buy 6, I believe, Saab Global I aircraft, with an estimated program cost of $5 billion Canadian dollars. This would fill a huge gap in Canada's capabilities. Part 8. All right, so what does this all amount to? Let's step back and answer the big questions. First, how does our North, strong and free, actually change Canada's defense posture compared to the 2017 strong, secure, engage? The answer is it doesn't blow up the SSE, but it does sharpen it. It gives it focus. It hones it. It makes the Arctic and the North, and by extension continental defense, the top priority. It names Russia and China as primary adversaries. It recenters NATO's northern and eastern flanks and the Indo-Pacific as the main theaters where the CAF is expected to show up. And it shifts the conceptual hook from process, anticipate, adapt, act, to outcome, ready, resilient, relevant. The CAF is now clearly framed as first as a sovereignty and deterrence instrument, defending Canada and North America through the Arctic, and then as a NATO contributor in high-end warfighting, and then as a supporting actor in the Indo-Pacific, and then global stability missions. Peacekeeping and capacity building is all still on the list, but it's no longer the heart of the story. Third, there's what Ottawa is actually doing, the Army, Navy, Air Force, to meet those priorities. It's restructuring the Army. It's buying a lot of equipment, trying to retool itself so that the Army can handle high-intensity warfare. The Navy is trying to develop more full spectrum capitalization with new ships, new everything, plus the new submarines. The Air Force is shifting to F-35s, new patrol aircraft, maybe some Gripens. And while Canada pours money into NORAD modernization and buys AWACS, etc. The through line is this: Canada wants to be treated as a serious ally in NATO and in the Pacific, but it knows that starts at home, in the Arctic and across North America. Are North strong and free in its attempt to write that logic down and attach some numbers to it, and to link it explicitly to industry and jobs? There is nonetheless a real risk that the Canadian government will fail to cough up enough money and to do all the things it says it's going to do. These things are expensive, after all. Recruiting people and retaining people, that's expensive. Acquiring new fighter jets, that's expensive. Buying new frigates and submarines, that's very expensive. It's all a question of money and political will. They have the money, they just need the will to actually do it. Now here's sort of a bright side, if I dare say so. Trump, since taking office in January 2025, has degraded U.S.-Canadian relations badly while also threatening Greenland and Denmark. This has not prompted the Carney administration to rewrite the ONSF, but it's clear from Carney's statements that perhaps Trump has heightened Canada's interest in Arctic defense and defending its sovereignty, because now there's an American threat. The world without a reliable American ally is a bad thing for Canada. It makes the world more dangerous for Canada. Now, thank you for watching this video. If you look in the description below, you're going to see links to my various social media, plus my Substack, which is also called Pax Americana, plus my own website, michaelshirkin.com. And stay tuned. There's plenty more in the pipeline. Thank you.